The mist clings to the sea like a shroud, heavy and silver-grey, rolling across waters that have no name in any tongue the mortals of Ireland will ever speak. Somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, past the ninth wave where the jurisdiction of earthly kings dissolves into salt spray and legend, there exist islands that shimmer between existence and dream. The Greeks whispered of Hyperborea. The Celts knew them as the Northern Isles, places where the veil between what is and what might be grows thin as spider silk, where cities rise not from quarried stone but from crystallized thought, and where beings of terrible beauty master arts that would shatter the minds of ordinary men. It is from these islands that they will come, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu, the Shining Ones. But to understand who they are, we must first understand what Ireland was before their coming, and what forces had already claimed dominion over its green hills and dark waters. The Lebor Gabála Érenn, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, that great medieval compilation of myth and pseudo-history, tells us that Ireland had been settled and abandoned, conquered and lost, no fewer than 5 times before the Tuatha Dé Danann descended upon its shores. The Sorcerers, who perished in the flood, the Partholon, who fell to plague after warring with the Fomorians, the Nemed, who fled after their own catastrophic conflict with those same dark powers, the Firbolg, who divided the land into 5 provinces and for a brief span knew something resembling peace, and always, lurking at the margins, dwelling beneath the waves and in the spaces between, there were the Fomorians. They are old, the Fomorians, old in ways that make mountains seem young. In some tellings they are monstrous, beings of chaos and dissolution, with single eyes and single arms, their bodies twisted into shapes that mock the symmetry the gods favour. In other accounts they are beautiful in the manner of storms at sea, terrible and magnificent, forces of nature given consciousness and will. The medieval scribes who preserved these tales working by candlelight in monasteries where the old gods had been christened into saints or cast down as demons struggled to make sense of the Fomorians. Were they giants, demons, the aboriginal spirits of the land itself? The Lebor Gabála suggests all of these and none, presenting them as a constant, the darkness that defines the light, the chaos against which order must eternally contend. It is against this darkness that the Tuatha Dé Danann will ultimately be measured, but not yet. First, we must speak of their preparation, of the long years they spent in those northern isles learning arts that would make them the masters of Ireland, at least for a time. The medieval texts speak of 4 cities in the north of the world, each one a centre of learning and craft, each one contributing something essential to the power the Tuatha Dé Danann would bring to Ireland. The names ring out across the centuries with a strange haunting resonance. Fallius, Gorius, Phineus and Murius. 4 cities, 4 druids, 4 treasures that would define the sovereignty of Ireland itself. Imagine, if you will, Fallius. The name means the hedged place, or perhaps the place of rings, depending on which etymology you trust. Here, in this city of high walls and deeper mysteries, there dwelt a druid called Morfessa, sometimes Morphis, whose wisdom was said to encompass the nature of kingship itself, what it meant to rule, what right looked like, how the land and its king were joined in a marriage more binding than any human contract. And in Fallius there was kept a stone, the Lia Fail, the stone of Fal, the stone of destiny. It sat at the heart of Fallius like a judgment waiting to be rendered, a pillar of grey rock shot through with veins of darker mineral, unassuming to the eye yet thrumming with a power that those who had learned to perceive such things could feel in their very bones. The stone of Fal had one property, one gift, one purpose. It would cry out, roaring its approval, when the rightful King of Ireland sat upon it or stood before it. No false claimant could compel its voice. No pretender could win its blessing. The stone knew. The stone remembered. The stone judged. Understand what this means. In a world where kingship was sacred, where the fertility of the land, the success of the harvest, the health of cattle, the victory in battle, all depended upon the rightness of the king's relationship with the sovereignty of the territory he ruled, a stone that could verify that relationship was not merely valuable, it was existentially necessary. With the Lia Fail, there could be no dispute about succession, no lingering doubts about legitimacy. The stone's cry would settle the matter for all time. The king was the king because the stone said so, and the stone could not lie. The Tuatha Dé Danann learned in Fallius the arts of sovereignty and judgment, the binding of ruler to land, the sacred compact between those who lead and those who follow. Morfessa taught them, and when they departed for Ireland, they carried the Stone of Fal with them. To the east, or what passed for east in those strange northern latitudes where geography was more symbolic than literal, lay Gorias, the city of valour. Here ruled Ezras, sometimes called Wiscias, a druid whose domain was not the subtleties of kingship but the purity of martial prowess. Gorias blazed. Even the stones of its streets seemed to radiate heat, an intensity that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the concentrated will of warriors perfecting their craft. In Gorias, the Tuatha Dé Danann learned to fight, not as mortals fight, with strength that fails and courage that wavers, but as something closer to abstract forces made manifest, violence refined to its most essential form. And in Gorias there was kept a spear, the spear of Lugh, the Gaia sail, the spear of lightning. Its shaft was ash, or perhaps rowan, depending on which tradition you follow, and its head was bronze that had never known a forge in this world. The spear of Lugh did not miss. This was not a matter of probability or skill. The spear simply could not miss. Once thrown, it would find its target across any distance, through any defence. Warriors who faced it could flee, could raise shields of enchanted bronze, could summon walls of flame or seas of ice, and still the spear would come for them, patient and inevitable as death itself. But the spear had another property, stranger and more dangerous than its unerring accuracy. It was alive, or something close to alive. Left unattended, it would begin to shake, to stir, to grow restless, and then it would seek blood on its own, striking out at anyone nearby, friend or foe alike. The only way to keep it quiescent was to plunge its head into a cauldron of water steeped in poppy and other soporific herbs, drugging it into sleep until its services were needed. Imagine the implications. A weapon that cannot be stopped but cannot be controlled, that must be kept in a state of induced slumber between battles lest it murder its keepers. The Spear of Lugh was not simply a tool of war, it was a manifestation of war's essential nature, its hunger that can never be sated, its restlessness that knows no peace. The Tuatha Dé Danann learned in Gorias the arts of combat and the terrible responsibility that comes with wielding power that has its own appetites. North and west lay Phineas, the city of illumination. If Gorias blazed with the fire of battle, Phineas shone with a different light, the cold and piercing radiance of perfect clarity. Here the druid Wiscias, or Wiscias was at Gorias depending on the text, and here it was Cineas, taught the arts of cutting through illusion, seeing things as they truly are, the warrior's virtue of decisive action taken in the moment before thought can cloud perception. Phineas was a city of edges, of definitions, of the boundaries between things made sharp as a blade, and in Phineas there was kept a sword, Cleum Soles, the sword of light, the sword of a Nuada, sometimes called the sword from whose stroke no one escapes. Where the spear of Lugh's guaranteed accuracy, the sword of Nuada guaranteed finality. Once drawn, it could not be turned aside. Once it cut, the wound could not be healed by any ordinary means. The sword's edge was so fine that it could part the very concept of resistance, slicing through not merely flesh and bone but through the will to fight, the hope of survival, the illusion that one might escape one's fate. To face the sword of Nuada was to face one's ending with perfect clarity. The sword was said to shine with its own light, a cold radiance that had nothing to do with the sun or moon or stars. In the darkest cavern, in the blackest night, the sword of Nuada would blaze like a torch, illuminating everything around it while remaining itself impossible to look upon directly. Warriors who had seen it, warriors who had survived seeing it, which were few, spoke of the way its light seemed to strip away all comforting shadows, all protective darkness, leaving everything exposed, every weakness revealed, every hidden thing laid bare. Nuada, whose name means he who distributes, or perhaps Cloudmaker, would one day wield this sword as king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. But that day was not yet come. First, the people of Danu had other arts to learn, other treasures to claim. South, though again, we must remember that south and north and east and west had different meanings in those primordial geographies, lay Murias, the city of abundance. Here the druid Semius held court over the mysteries of sustenance and satisfaction, the deep magic of enough. If Phalius taught sovereignty, Gorius taught war, and Phineus taught clarity, then Marius taught the most essential art of all, the keeping of life. And in Marius there was kept a cauldron, the cauldron of the Dagda, the Undri, the Choir Dagdae. It was not a small vessel, this cauldron. The accounts vary, but some suggest it was vast, large enough for men to bathe in, large enough to cook a feast for an army. Its material was bronze, or perhaps some alloy unknown to mortal smiths, and its surface was worked with spirals and knots that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from the corner of the eye. But its size and craftsmanship were incidental to its power. The cauldron of the Dagda had one property that rendered all other concerns moot. No company ever left it unsatisfied. Think about what this means. Not merely that it provided food, but that it provided enough food. Always enough. Whether 5 came to the cauldron or 5,000, whether the land was bountiful or blighted by famine, whether the harvest had been rich or ruined, there would be enough. The cauldron did not create food from nothing, or perhaps it did, the texts are unclear. But it created sufficiency, that mysterious quality that transforms scarcity into abundance, not by increasing quantity, but by ensuring that what existed was perfectly matched to what was needed. The Dagda, who would one day possess this cauldron, was many things: king for a time, druid, warrior, lover, father. But above all, he was the good god, not good in any moral sense, but good in the sense of being good at everything, capable, sufficient, equal to any task. And his cauldron reflected this aspect of his nature, providing not excess but adequacy, not surfeit but satisfaction. These then were the 4 treasures: stone and spear, sword and cauldron, sovereignty and war, clarity and abundance. Together they represented not merely powerful artifacts but a complete cosmology, a vision of what rightful rule looked like. The true king was he who was recognized by the land itself, the stone, who could defend his people, the spear, who could see clearly and act decisively, the sword, and who could ensure that none went hungry under his protection, the cauldron. Miss any one of these qualities and you might be a chieftain, a warlord, a pretender. Possess all 4, and you were a king in the only sense that mattered. For years uncounted, the Tuatha Dé Danann remained in those northern isles, mastering arts that would have taken mortal men generations to even glimpse. They studied with the 4 druids. They practiced with the 4 treasures. They became something more than they had been, something that the Lebor Gabála struggles to name but never quite succeeds. Gods? Not exactly, for they could die, would die, some of them, in the battles to come. Spirits? But they had bodies, flesh that could be cut, blood that could be spilled. Something between, something other, something the Christian monks who recorded these stories had no framework to understand, and so preserved with a strange fidelity, like entomologists pinning specimens they cannot classify. And then, when their preparation was complete, they came to Ireland. The texts tell us they arrived in a fleet of ships, which they burned upon landing so that none might be tempted to flee. Other accounts say they came in clouds, descending from the sky like a storm made of intent and purpose, settling upon the mountains of Connemara in darkness and smoke. Perhaps both are true, perhaps neither. The Lebor Gabála, compiled from older sources by monks who are not entirely sure how literally to take the tales they transcribed, offers multiple versions and lets the reader choose. What matters is not the method of arrival, but the meaning. The Tuatha Dé Danann came to Ireland as conquerors, and they came to stay. They landed, or descended, upon Sliab an Érenn, the Iron Mountain, which we call Slieve an Érenn today, in what would become County Leitrim. For 3 days the sun did not rise over Ireland. For 3 days darkness lay upon the land like a blanket, and the Firbolg who then ruled the island huddled in their ring forts and wondered what new calamity had befallen them. They had heard tales, the Firbolg, of their distant cousins who had departed into the north to learn the secret arts. Now those cousins had returned, and they had brought the darkness with them. The Firbolg were a practical people. Their name means men of bags, or perhaps men of the belly, suggesting either their skill in making leather containers or their association with agricultural abundance. They had come to Ireland themselves as conquerors, fleeing oppression in Greece according to some tellings, and they had divided the island into 5 provinces: Ulster, Leinster, Munster, and 2 parts of Connaught. They had kings and warriors, cattle and crops, all the things that made a people prosper. But they did not have what the Tuatha Dé Danann had brought with them from the north. When the darkness lifted on the 4th day, the Firbolg sent ambassadors to learn what manner of beings had arrived. The Tuatha Dé Danann received them with courtesy, but also with unmistakable confidence. They had not come to negotiate, they had come to rule. If the Firbolg wished to share Ireland with them, dividing the island between the 2 peoples, that could perhaps be arranged. If they wished to dispute the matter by force of arms, well, that could be arranged too. The Firbolg king was Eochaid mac Éirc, a man renowned for his justice and the prosperity of his reign. Under his rule, no rain fell in Ireland, which in those days was considered a blessing, the land producing its bounty through dew alone, without the violence of storms or the destruction of floods. No falsehood could be uttered in his presence, or so the stories claimed, and any weapon that drew unjust blood would turn against the hand that wielded it. Eochaid was a good king by the standards of his people, but his goodness would not be enough to preserve his throne. The ambassadors returned to Tara, where Eochaid held his court and reported what they had seen. The Tuatha Dé Danann were beautiful, they said. Beautiful and terrible. Their weapons were like nothing the Firbolg possessed, their bearing that of beings who had never known defeat. They had come with treasures of unearthly power and arts learned in cities that existed only at the world's edge. They offered half of Ireland or war. Eochaid consulted with his warriors and his druids. Half of Ireland was a bitter draught to swallow, but better perhaps than losing everything. And yet, the Firbolg were not without courage, not without skill, not without their own kings and champions who had never known defeat either. To surrender half their patrimony without striking a blow? What would posterity say of them? What would their ancestors think, watching from whatever realm the dead inhabited? In the end, pride won out over prudence, or perhaps it was courage over cowardice, or perhaps there simply was no good option, and the Firbolg chose the one that let them keep their self-respect. They rejected the offer of partition. They would meet the Tuatha Dé Danann in battle. Let the gods, let whatever powers watched over the fates of peoples, decide who deserved to rule Ireland. Both sides began their preparations for war. The Tuatha Dé Danann had the advantage in arts and artifacts, in training and treasures, but the Firbolg knew the land, knew its every hillock and hollow, knew where the bogs would swallow an unwary army and where the fords could be crossed. They had numbers too, not overwhelming numbers, but enough to make any battle a genuine contest. And they had a king whose reign had been marked by prosperity and justice, whose right to rule had been confirmed by the very absence of destructive weather, by the blessing of the land itself. The Tuatha Dé Danann, meanwhile, chose their own king to lead them in the war to come. His name was Nuada, he of the silver hand, though at this time his hand was still flesh and bone, the silver a tragedy yet to come. Nuada was a warrior king, skilled in the arts of combat that Gorius had taught, but also wise in the ways of sovereignty that Phalius had imparted. He carried the sword that bore his name, the Claiom Soles, and when he drew it, all who saw its light knew that death had come to stand among them. The 2 armies gathered on the Plain of Pillars, Mag Tuired, in what is now County Mayo. It was a liminal place, a threshold between territories, neither fully claimed by either people. Standing stones rose from the plain, monuments to some power or purpose that neither the Firbolg nor the Tuatha Dé Danann could remember clearly. Perhaps they had been erected by the Nemedians centuries before, perhaps by some people older still. The stones watched as the armies arrayed themselves for battle, and if they remembered why they had been raised, they kept their counsel. What followed would be remembered as the first battle of Mag Tuired, to distinguish it from a second, greater conflict that would come later. For 4 days the armies skirmished and parleyed, testing each other's strength, looking for weaknesses to exploit. The Tuatha Dé Danann displayed their superior weapons, javelins that flew farther and struck harder than anything the Firbolg possessed. The Firbolg responded with ferocious charges that drove their enemies back by sheer weight of bodies and fury. Each night both sides retreated to tend their wounded and burn their dead, and each morning they returned to the killing ground to continue the work. On the 5th day, the battle was joined in earnest. No more skirmishing, no more probing attacks. The full strength of both peoples threw itself into the conflict, and the plain of pillars ran red with blood. Nuada led from the front as kings were expected to do, his sword blazing like a torch in the dust and chaos. Wherever he struck, men fell and did not rise. Wherever he passed, the Firbolg line crumbled and gave way. For a time it seemed that the Tuatha Dé Danann would simply sweep their enemies from the field, that their superior arts and weapons would prove as decisive as they had believed. But the Firbolg had their own champions, their own warriors who had never known defeat. Chief among them was Shreng, a fighter of legendary strength and savagery, who wielded a great sword that the tales describe as rimmed or scalloped, its edge worked into a pattern that caused wounds no healer could close. Shreng cut his way through the Tuatha Dé Danann ranks like a farmer cutting wheat, leaving a trail of dead and dying behind him. And then, at the height of the battle, he found himself face to face with Nuada. King against champion, sword of light against scalloped blade. The two fought while the battle raged around them, their combat a thing of terrible beauty, stroke and counterstroke exchanged with a skill that left observers breathless. Nuada was faster, his movements almost inhuman in their precision. But Shreng was stronger, his blows carrying a force that no mortal man should have possessed. For long minutes neither could gain the advantage. And then Shreng struck a blow that Nuada could not quite parry. The scalloped blade bit deep into the king's arm, shearing through flesh and bone, and Nuada's hand, his sword hand, the hand that had held the Clayum Soleil, fell to the blood-soaked ground. The king staggered. The sword of light fell from his severed wrist. For a moment, the battle seemed to pause, both sides registering what had happened. Then the Tuatha Dé Danann surged forward, forming a wall of shields around their fallen leader, dragging him back from the killing ground. The first battle of Mag Tuired was over. Both sides withdrew to count their losses. The Firbolg had inflicted terrible casualties. Hundreds of the Tuatha Dé Danann lay dead on the plain, and their king was maimed, his sword hand gone, his ability to lead in battle crippled. But the Firbolg losses were worse, far worse. Their king, Eochaid mac Éirc, had fallen in the fighting, struck down by the very champions he had hoped to defeat. 100,000 of his warriors, the number is surely exaggerated, but the medieval scribes wanted to convey enormity, lay dead beside him. The Firbolg were broken, their strength shattered beyond recovery. Nuada lived. His physicians, the most skilled healers in any world, cauterized the wound and kept him from death's door. But under the laws of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a king must be whole, unblemished, physically perfect. A king missing a hand was no king at all. Nuada Getlam, Nuada of the silver arm he would later be called, but the arm was not yet fashioned, and for now he was simply Nuada, the king who had led his people to victory and then lost his throne in the moment of triumph. The Tuatha Dé Danann needed a new king, and in that need lay the seeds of a tragedy that would unfold across the years to come, drawing ever closer the shadow of the Fomorians and the hero who would rise to face them. But those are tales for another time. For now, the Tuatha Dé Danann held Ireland. The Stone of Fal stood at Tara, crying out its recognition when the rightful king approached. The Spear of Lugh slumbered in its cauldron of drugged water, dreaming whatever dreams a hungry weapon dreams. The Sword of Light lay quiet, waiting for a hand, whole or silver, to lift it once more. And the cauldron of the Dagda provided for all who came to it, ensuring that none among the victors went hungry, even as they mourned their dead and wondered what fresh conflicts awaited them. The Firbolg, those who survived, retreated to the margins of Ireland, to Aran Islands and the far western reaches where even the Tuatha Dé Danann did not care to pursue them. There they would remain, diminished but not destroyed, their descendants inhabiting those rocky western shores for generations to come. Some tales say they made peace with their conquerors eventually. Others suggest the enmity never fully healed. What is certain is that they faded from the centre of the island story, making way for the next act of the long drama. And in the shadows, patient and ancient, the Fomorians watched. They had seen peoples come and go, had warred with Partholonians and Nemedians alike, had learned that every new ruler of Ireland eventually stumbled, eventually faltered, eventually offered an opening that could be exploited. The Tuatha Dé Danann were powerful, more powerful perhaps than any who had come before, but they had just lost their king to a maiming wound, and now they would have to choose another. The Fomorians could wait. They had been waiting since before memory began. They could wait a little longer. The question of succession hung over the Tuatha Dé Danann like a storm cloud refusing to break. In the days following the battle, as the crows grew fat on the fallen and the healers worked their arts on the wounded, the nobles and druids gathered to determine who would sit upon the throne that Nuada could no longer rightfully claim. The choice they made would prove disastrous, though none among them could have foreseen just how badly it would turn. There was a man among them, half among them truly, named Brawny Bray the Beautiful they called him, for he was fair beyond the fairness of ordinary men, his features so perfectly formed that bards would struggle to describe them without resorting to comparisons with sunrise and starlight. His mother was Eriu, a woman of the Tuatha Dé Danann, one of the goddesses who would later give her name to the island itself. But his father was Elatha, a king of the Fomorians. How such a union came to be is a tale of night and mystery, of a silver ship that appeared on the shore, and a beautiful stranger who came ashore to lie with Eriu before departing with the dawn. 9 months later, Brez was born, and Eriu raised him among her own people, perhaps hoping that his Tuatha Dé Danann blood would prove stronger than his Fomorian heritage. In his youth, this seemed to be the case. Brez was golden and glorious, a credit to any lineage. He was a warrior of respectable skill, a presence that commanded attention in any gathering, and crucially, he was whole and unblemished in body, meeting the requirement that Nuada no longer could. The nobles, faced with the need for a new king and perhaps bedazzled by Brez's supernatural beauty, elevated him to the throne. It must have seemed reasonable at the time. He was of their blood, at least in part. He was physically perfect. And some whispered that an alliance through marriage might soften the ancient enmity with the Fomorians, might bring peace to a land that had known nothing but successive invasions since Cessair's women first stepped upon its shores. If Brez could bridge the gap between the children of Danu and the dark powers of the sea, surely that would be worth any price. They learned the price soon enough. Brez proved to be a king of surpassing miserliness and cruelty. Where the Tuatha Dé Danann valued generosity above almost all other virtues, Brez hoarded. Where they cherished their poets and artists, Brez humiliated them. Where a proper king would ensure that every noble's knife was greased with the fat of feasting, Brez's court offered thin fare and thinner welcome. The great halls that should have rung with music and laughter fell silent under his reign. The fires that should have blazed with hospitality guttered and smoked. The Dagda himself, that mighty lord of abundance, was reduced to menial labour under Brez's rule. The great god who could feed armies from his inexhaustible cauldron was set to building fortifications like a common thrall. His massive hands, meant for war and wonder, calloused from carrying stones and digging ditches. This was the depth of the humiliation Brez inflicted upon his own people. Even their greatest champions were treated as servants, their dignity stripped away day by grinding day. But it was the treatment of Cairpri, the chief poet of the Tuatha Dé Danann, that finally broke the bonds of toleration. Cairpri came to Brez's court as custom demanded, expecting the hospitality due to one of his station. A poet of the Tuatha Dé Danann was no mere entertainer, but a repository of sacred knowledge, a keeper of lineages and laws, a voice whose words could raise kings or bring them low. Such a one deserved honour, feasting, the finest of accommodations. Instead, Brez housed him in a tiny dark cell with no fire to warm him. Instead of the lavish meals that should have graced his table, Cairpri received 3 small dry cakes on a small dry plate, an insult so calculated, so deliberate, that it could not be mistaken for mere thoughtlessness. Brez knew what he was doing. He was demonstrating his contempt for the very traditions that held his people together. Cairpri's response echoed through the ages. He composed a satire, the first satire in Ireland, the medieval texts claim, though surely mockery is as old as speech itself. His words were poison wrapped in poetry, a curse dressed in verse. He spoke of Brez's hospitality, or lack thereof. He spoke of a king without generosity, which among the Tuatha Dé Danann was akin to speaking of a sun without light. He spoke, and his words raised blisters on Brez's perfect face, marring that supernatural beauty with the visible marks of shame. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Among the peoples of medieval Ireland, and presumably among the divine beings they wrote about, a poet's satire was not mere insult, but magical assault. The words of a master poet could maim or kill, could wither crops and sicken cattle, could bring ruin upon a king and all his line. When Cairbrie's satire marked Bress's face, it marked the beginning of the end of his reign. A blemished king could no more rule than a maimed one. The very quality that had elevated Bress to power, his physical perfection, was now compromised. But Bray did not relinquish power gracefully. His rule had been marked by another trend far more dangerous than his personal stinginess. He had been drawing the Fomorians ever deeper into the affairs of Ireland. Perhaps it was natural enough. He was half Fomorian himself, after all, and blood calls to blood. Perhaps he had planned it from the beginning, a Trojan horse placed upon the throne to open the gates for his father's people. Whatever his motivations, the result was clear. Under Bress's reign, the Fomorians had established tribute systems that bled the Tuatha Dé Danann of their wealth and strength. Heavy taxes flowed outward to the islands where the Fomorians dwelt, and in return the people of Danu received nothing but the promise that they would not be destroyed outright. It was oppression by degree, the slow strangling of a conquered people who had not even realised they had been conquered. The Tuatha Dé Danann, who had come to Ireland as masters of magic and war, who had carried with them the 4 treasures of the 4 cities, found themselves grinding under a foreign yoke, and at the head of the foreign power stood Bela of the Evil Eye, the most terrible of all the Fomorian lords. Bela was ancient even by the standards of beings for whom age had little meaning. He had been old when the world was young, had watched the first light break over the primordial waters, had accumulated power and malice through spans of time that made mortal lifetimes seem like the flicker of a candle. But his greatest weapon was not his age or his cunning, it was his eye. The tales vary in their explanation of how Bela's eye came to be what it was. Some say he had gazed upon a forbidden sight in his youth, a druidic poison being brewed by his father's sorcerers, and the toxic smoke had transformed his eye into a weapon of devastation. Others say the eye was simply part of his nature, a gift or curse from powers older still than the Fomorians themselves. What all the tales agree upon is its effect. When Bela's eye opened, everything it gazed upon died. This was not a gentle death, not a slipping away into peaceful darkness. When Bela's eye opened fully, flesh withered from bone, armies crumpled like dry leaves in a furnace, the very earth was blasted and scorched beyond any hope of recovery. The eye was so powerful, so devastatingly effective, that Bela kept it closed most of the time, the lid so heavy that it required 4 men to raise it using a polished hook. Only in the direst need would Bela open that eye, and when he did, his enemies did not survive long enough to regret their opposition. This was the power that stood behind Bress, the shadow father of a shadow king. As long as Bress ruled, the Fomorians had a foothold in Ireland that they had never before achieved. They need not conquer through open war, not while their puppets sat upon the throne, but the Tuatha Dé Danann were not without their own resources, and in the years of Bress's misrule one figure emerged who would change everything. Dian Cecht, the god of healing, and his son Miach, whose skills would prove even greater than his father's. Nuada had lived with his maiming, his shame, his loss of kingship for 7 years. 7 years is a span of significance in the old tales. It marks transitions, transformations, the completion of cycles. For 7 years, Nuada had watched Bress destroy everything his people valued, had chafed under a reign he could do nothing to challenge. Without his hand, he could not be king. Without a king of their own blood and spirit, the Tuatha Dé Danann could not throw off the Fomorian yoke. It was a perfect trap, and it might have held forever had Dian Cecht not decided to act. The god of healing was renowned throughout all the worlds for his mastery of medicine and surgery. It was he who tended the wounded after Mag Tuired, he whose knowledge kept warriors from death's door and restored the sick to health. Now he turned that knowledge toward a single purpose, making Nuada whole once more. The army fashioned was a wonder beyond the dreams of mortal smiths. It was silver, pure shining silver, articulated with joints that moved as smoothly as living bone, with fingers that could grip a sword or cradle a cup with equal facility. Dian Cecht worked the metal with tools no human hand could wield, shaping it through arts that blended craftsmanship with magic. When he attached the silver arm to Nuada's stump, it took on life, responding to Nuada's will as if it had always been part of his body. Nuada Getlam, Nuada of the Silver Arm. The epithet that would follow him through all the ages of storytelling, through manuscript and folklore and modern retellings, was born in that moment when silver became flesh, when craft became miracle. But the arm, for all its wonder, was still silver. It was still artificial, and under the strict interpretation of the law, a silver arm was not the same as a flesh arm. Nuada was improved, was functional, was magnificent in his way, but was he truly whole? It was Miach, Diancecht's own son, who resolved the question in a fashion that would cost him dearly. Miach had learned healing at his father's knee, but his talents had grown beyond what Diancecht had taught. Where the father saw limits, the son saw possibilities. Where Diancecht had crafted a silver replacement, Miach envisioned something more radical: actual restoration. The tales describe his method in language both clinical and magical. Miach took Nuada's original arm, whether preserved through enchantment or retrieved from wherever it had been kept, and reattached it to the king's body. Through 3 days and 3 nights of continuous healing, he coaxed bone to knit with bone, vessel to join with vessel, nerve to weave with nerve. He chanted words of power over the sundered flesh, drawing upon arts that perhaps no one had ever employed before. By the end of the 3rd night, Nuada had 2 arms of flesh and blood, the severed hand restored to its original place, moving and gripping and feeling as it had before Streng's blow had parted it from his wrist. The king was whole. The king could rule. Diancecht's response to his son's triumph was not pride, but murderous rage. Perhaps he saw Miach's achievement as an affront, a declaration that the son had surpassed the father. Perhaps he feared being diminished in the eyes of their people. Whatever drove him, Diancecht attacked his own son, striking him down with repeated blows that eventually proved fatal. 3 times he wounded Miach, and 3 times Miach healed himself. The 4th blow split Miach's brain, and not even his own formidable powers could heal that. They buried Miach, and from his grave grew 365 herbs, one for every joint and sinew of the human body, each herb a cure for the ailment of its corresponding part. All the healing knowledge in the world sprouted from the healer's grave, a final gift from one who had given everything to his art. But Diancecht, still consumed by whatever dark passion had driven him to murder his son, scattered the herbs, mixing them beyond any hope of sorting. And this, the old tales say, is why we do not know all the cures, because a jealous god could not bear to be outdone, even by his own child. But these are shadows at the edge of the greater story. What matters most is that Nuada was whole again, and a whole Nuada could be king. The Tuatha Dé Danann moved against Bress with the swiftness of those who have waited too long already. The blemished, satirized king could make no claim against a restored rival. Bress was deposed, stripped of his authority, driven from the throne he had so shamefully occupied. He fled to his father's people, to the Fomorians, bringing with him grievances and plans for revenge. Nuada resumed his kingship, taking up once more the burden he had been forced to set aside. The Stone of Fal cried out at his approach, recognizing the rightful ruler, and the people rejoiced to have their true king back among them. The Clayum Soleils was returned to his hand, his flesh hand now restored and whole, and the spear of Lugh stirred in its drugged sleep, sensing that times of consequence were approaching. But the rejoicing was tempered by the knowledge that war was coming. Bress had gone to the Fomorians not merely as a refugee but as a goad, a cause, an excuse. He had been king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and he had been removed by force. The Fomorians, who had grown comfortable with their puppet on Ireland's throne, who had enjoyed the tribute and the influence that Breace's reign had brought them, now had justification for open conflict. The uneasy relationship between the two peoples, maintained through Breace's collaboration, shattered with his departure. And there was more. The Fomorians had learned much during Breace's reign, about the Tuatha Dé Danann's strengths and weaknesses, about the treasures they possessed, about the divisions that could be exploited. They knew that the Dagda's cauldron could feed armies, that the spear of Lugh could turn battles, that the sword of light could cut through any defence. They knew too that the Tuatha Dé Danann were not invincible. Nuada himself had been maimed in the first battle for Ireland. Others could be maimed again, or killed outright. Bela of the Evil Eye began to muster his forces, from the dark islands where the Fomorians dwelt, from the depths of the cold sea and the shadows beneath the world, the ancient powers gathered for war. This would not be like the conflicts with the Firbolg, who had been mortals of a sort, limited in their powers and their lifespans. This would be a war between divine beings, between the children of the light and the spawn of primordial chaos. This would be the second battle of Mag Tuired, and it would determine the fate of Ireland for ages to come. Nuada knew what was coming. Restored to his throne, possessed once more of his full faculties, he could read the signs as clearly as any druid. War was inevitable, and it would be terrible beyond imagining. The Tuatha Dé Danann would need every advantage, every ally, every ounce of power they could muster. It was during this time of preparation that a stranger came to Tara. The gates of the royal seat were guarded by a doorkeeper whose duty was to admit only those who possessed skills of value to the king. No one could enter Tara unless they had something to offer, some talent or craft that would benefit the Tuatha Dé Danann. This was not mere snobbery but survival. In a world where every advantage counted, there was no room for those who could not contribute. The stranger who approached the gates was young in appearance, beautiful as many of the Tuatha Dé Danann were beautiful, but there was something about him that marked him as different. He moved with a purpose that suggested destiny, carried himself with an assurance that bordered on arrogance. When the doorkeeper challenged him, demanding to know what skill he brought to Tara, the stranger's answer would become one of the most celebrated exchanges in all of Irish mythology. "I am a carpenter," the stranger said. "We have a carpenter," the doorkeeper replied. "Luchta serves us well, we have no need of another." "I am a smith. Goibniu is our smith, and there is none better. I am a champion, a warrior of great prowess. Ogma holds that place among us. I am a harper. We have a harper. I am a poet and a historian. We have both. I am a sorcerer. Our sorcerers are many and powerful. I am a physician. Dian Sesht serves as our healer. I am a cupbearer. We have cupbearers in plenty. I am a brazier, a craftsman in bronze. Crednit is our brazier, unmatched in his art." The stranger smiled then, and in that smile was the knowledge of what was coming, the certainty of his own importance. "Go and ask your king," he said, "whether he has any single man who possesses all these skills at once. If he does, I will leave Tara and trouble you no more. If he does not, then perhaps he has need of me after all." The doorkeeper went to Nuada and reported the stranger's claim. The king listened, considering. A man who was master of one craft was valuable. A man who mastered two was rare. But a man who claimed mastery of all the arts and skills that the Tuatha Dé Danann prized? Such a one was either a liar of monumental audacity or something altogether new and necessary. "Let him enter," Nuada commanded. "Let us see what this stranger can do." The gates of Tara opened, and Lugh Lamfada, Lugh of the Long Arm, stepped across the threshold. He was the son of Cian of the Tuatha Dé Danann and Ethniu, daughter of Baelor of the Evil Eye. In his veins flowed the blood of both peoples, light and dark, divine radiance and primordial chaos. He was prophecy made flesh, the one foretold to bring doom to Baelor, the champion who would decide the outcome of the coming war. But prophecy unfolds in its own time. For now, Lugh was simply a stranger with extraordinary claims, standing before a king who needed every advantage he could find. Nuada proposed a test, a game of Fitchel, the board game of kings and strategists. If Lugh could demonstrate his skill in this arena of tactical thinking, it would speak well for his other claims. They played, and Lugh won. He won not merely through luck, but through a mastery of strategy that left Nuada impressed despite himself. Here was a mind that could see patterns within patterns, could anticipate moves and counter-moves with an almost prophetic clarity. Whatever else Lugh might be, he was not a fool or a braggart without substance. Nuada made a decision that demonstrated his own wisdom as a king. He rose from his throne and offered it to Lugh, ceding the seat of power to this newcomer for a period of 13 days. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement that in the crisis to come, they would need leadership that transcended ordinary capabilities. For 13 days, Lugh sat in the king's place, and in that time he demonstrated skill after skill, art after art, mastering every challenge put before him. He was not merely competent, he excelled. He played the harp with a beauty that moved even the most hardened warriors to tears. He composed poetry that the bards would remember for generations. He crafted metal with a precision that made Goibniu nod in reluctant approval. He fought with a brilliance that drew gasps from the assembled champions. He was, as he had claimed, the Simildanach, the master of all arts simultaneously. But it was not merely his skills that marked Lugh as extraordinary. It was his understanding of what was coming and what would be required to survive it. He had grown up knowing who his grandfather was, knowing that Béla's prophecy-haunted eye would one day seek his destruction. He had prepared for this moment, had trained himself in every art because he knew that half measures would not suffice against the powers of darkness. He was not simply talented, he was purposeful. Every skill he had mastered was a weapon for the war to come. When the 13 days ended, Nuada resumed his throne, but the power dynamics had shifted. Lugh was now acknowledged as a leader among the Tuatha Dé Danann, a war chief whose counsel would be sought and heeded. The king remained king, but beside him stood the champion who would lead them into battle. And in the shadows where the Fomorians gathered their strength, Béla of the Evil Eye felt the stirring of fate. Somewhere, somehow, the doom foretold for him was taking shape. The grandson he had tried to prevent from being born, the child he had ordered drowned at birth only to see saved by the machinations of others, now stood among his enemies, preparing to fulfill the prophecy that had haunted Béla for so long. The pieces were in place, the board was set. The second battle of Mag Tuired, the battle that would determine whether light or darkness would hold dominion over Ireland, drew inexorably closer. The gathering came like a storm building beyond the horizon, inevitable, darkening, charged with the promise of cataclysm. In the great hall of Tara, the leaders of the Tuatha Dé Danann assembled not for celebration, but for the grim arithmetic of war. Nuada Silverhand presided, his restored arm gleaming in the firelight, but all eyes turned frequently to Lugh, who stood among them now as strategist and champion, the living weapon around whom their hopes crystallized. The Fomorians had not been idle. Across the cold waters, in their stronghold of Torinis, the glass tower that rose from the northern sea like a fang of frozen darkness, Béla marshalled forces that would have overwhelmed any ordinary people. The Fomorians were ancient beyond reckoning, born from the chaos that preceded order, and their power was not diminished by the years. If anything, their long exile had sharpened their hunger. They remembered Ireland when it was young, remembered a time when they had walked as masters upon its soil, and they intended to walk so again over the corpses of these bright newcomers who dared to call themselves divine. Brez, the dethroned king, had found his way to Béla's court and had poured poison into ears already inclined toward violence. He spoke of the Tuatha Dé Danann's weaknesses, of their divisions, of the ways they might be broken. He offered himself as a guide who knew their defences, their hiding places, their secrets. Treachery had always been his true craft, and now he practiced it with the desperate enthusiasm of one who has nothing left to lose. But the Tuatha Dé Danann were not without their own preparations. Lugh had spent his time well, moving among the assembled tribes and clans, taking measure of every resource, every capability, every hidden strength that might be brought to bear. He understood, perhaps better than any among them, that this war would not be won by champions alone. It would be won, if it could be won at all, by the combined genius of an entire people, and so he called upon them one by one, asking each what they would contribute to the struggle ahead. The Dagda rose first, that massive figure of primal appetite and profound wisdom, and his voice rumbled through the hall like distant thunder. He would bring his club, he said, the terrible weapon that could slay 9 men with a single stroke of one end, and restore the dead to life with a touch of the other. He would bring his cauldron from which none ever departed hungry. He would bring himself, his strength, his magic, his willingness to wade into the heart of battle without counting the cost. The Dagda had feasted with the Fomorians once at their demand, when they had filled a pit in the earth with porridge and meat, and dared him to consume it all on pain of death. He had eaten every morsel, scraping the bottom of the pit with his ladle, and had walked away alive because they had underestimated his capacity for excess. He would not be underestimated again. Goibniu spoke next. Goibniu the smith, whose forge burned with fires that were not entirely of this world. He would make weapons, he promised, spears and swords without number, and every blade that left his anvil would strike true. No spear he fashioned would miss its mark, no sword would break at the crucial moment. More than this, he possessed knowledge of healing that went beyond mere medicine. Warriors who fell in battle, if they were not utterly slain, would be restored by his arts, their wounds closed, their strength renewed, and sent back into the fight before the enemy could take satisfaction in their deaths. The wounded would rise again and again until the Fomorians wondered if they faced an immortal host. Beside Goibniu stood his brothers of craft, Creedne the brazier and Lushstein the carpenter. Creedon would forge the rivets that held spearheads to shafts, working with such speed that he would throw each rivet from his tongs across the distance to where it was needed, and everyone would find its mark perfectly. Lugh would shape the shafts themselves, cutting and smoothing the wood with 3 strokes only, so that weapons would spring from their work as fast as men could wield them. Between the 3 of them, they would arm the host of the Tuatha Dé Danann with instruments of war that mortal smiths could not have produced in years of labour. Dian Sesht, the physician whose skill had fashioned Nuada's silver arm, pledged his arts to the healing of the wounded. He spoke of a well, a sacred pool into which the injured and the dying would be lowered, and from which they would emerge whole and ready to fight again. The Well of Slain, he called it, the Well of Health, and its waters would be imbued with such power that death itself would struggle to claim those who bathed in them. As long as the well flowed, as long as its healing properties remained intact, the Tuatha Dé Danann would have an advantage that no ordinary army could match. Ogma, the champion of eloquence whose strength matched his wisdom, swore that he would face the mightiest of the Fomorian champions in single combat. He would carry the battle to the enemy's greatest warriors and would not rest until he had proved that skill and courage could overcome brute malevolence. His muscles bore the memory of 1,000 contests, and his mind held the collected wisdom of ages. Let the Fomorians send their strongest, Ogma would answer. The Morrigan rose then, and the air in the hall seemed to thicken, to grow heavy with the smell of blood and burning. She was war itself, this goddess of slaughter and sovereignty, and her eyes held the sight of deaths yet to come. She would be on the battlefield, she said, not merely as a warrior, but as a power that shaped the very nature of conflict. She would sow confusion in the enemy ranks, would steal the courage from Fomorian hearts, would sing the songs that made men forget why they had come to fight. Her presence alone would be worth 1,000 spears, for she was the spirit of battle incarnate, and where she walked, the tide of war followed. Lugh listened to each pledge, weighing and calculating, seeing in his mind's eye how these pieces might fit together into a strategy that could stand against the darkness. The Fomorians were not merely numerous, they were led by Bela of the Evil Eye, whose very gaze was death. Whatever plans they made, whatever preparations they undertook, all would come to nothing if Bela opened that terrible eye upon the battlefield. The poison of that gaze had been strengthened by decades of concentration, of hatred nursed and fed. One look from Bela could wither an army. One glance could end the Tuatha Dé Danann forever. And yet this was precisely why Lugh stood among them. He was the prophecy, the doom foretold, the grandson whose very existence Bela had tried to prevent. There was a thread of fate connecting them, grandfather and grandson, and that thread would be cut only when one of them fell. Lugh did not speak of this openly. He did not need to. Everyone in the hall understood why he had come, understood what role he was meant to play. The question was whether fate would unfold as the prophecy suggested, or whether the darkness would prove stronger than destiny. The preparations that followed were undertaken with a desperate intensity. Throughout the lands held by the Tuatha Dé Danann, forges burned day and night, their smoke rising to join the clouds that gathered over Ireland. Warriors trained in the morning mists and the evening shadows, perfecting their skills, conditioning their bodies for the ordeal ahead. Druids withdrew to sacred groves and stood beneath ancient trees, communing with powers that existed before the world took its present shape, seeking every advantage that magic and wisdom might provide. Lugh himself moved through these preparations like a general inspecting his troops, but also like something more, like a force of nature that had taken human form for this specific purpose. He offered counsel to the strategists, encouragement to the warriors, respect to the craftsmen whose labour would arm and armour the host. He was everywhere, tireless, as though the energy of the sun itself burned within him and would not let him rest until the work was complete. Among the treasures that the Tuatha Dé Danann had brought from their 4 cities, 2 would prove crucial in the battle to come. The Spear of Lugh, that weapon of living fire that never missed its mark and against which no armour could stand, would be wielded by its namesake, the champion for whom it seemed to have been waiting through all the long years, and the Sword of Nuada, that blade whose blow could not be survived once it was drawn from its sheath, would rest at the king's side, waiting for the moment when it would drink the blood of Fomorian champions. But treasures alone would not win this war. It was the spirit of the Tuatha Dé Danann, their refusal to bow before the darkness, their determination to hold what they had won, against any power that sought to take it. This was the weapon that could not be measured or weighed, but without which all other weapons would be useless. They were the people of the goddess Danu, inheritors of divine knowledge, masters of arts that the Fomorians could not comprehend. They had not come to Ireland to be slaves or victims. They had come to be its sovereigns, and sovereignty was not a thing they would surrender while any of them still drew breath. The day came when scouts reported that the Fomorian host had made landfall. They came from the north, from the darkness beyond the edge of the world, and their numbers seemed to blot out the horizon. Great ships had carried them across the bitter waters, ships crewed by creatures that had never known the warmth of sunlight, warriors whose weapons were forged in caverns where fire burned cold. At their head came Bela himself, carried on a platform borne by his strongest servants, for the weight of power had bent his body over the long years until walking was a difficulty he disdained. His single eye, the eye of destruction, remained closed, its lid held down by a great ring through which ran chains worked by strong men. It took 9 warriors to lift that lid, and when they did, whatever Bela gazed upon withered and died. Mountains had been levelled by that eye. Forests had burned to ash. Armies had ceased to exist in an instant of unbearable destruction. The field they chose for the conflict was Mag Tuired once more, the same plain where the Tuatha Dé Danann had broken the power of the Firbolg, where Nuada had lost his arm and the price of victory had been paid in royal blood. It seemed fitting that here, on this ground already consecrated by battle, the fate of Ireland would be decided again. The earth remembered the blood that had been spilled upon it. The stones remembered the cries of the fallen. This place had been marked by war once, and now war would return to claim it utterly. The Tuatha Dé Danann arrayed themselves across the plain as the first grey light of morning crept over the eastern hills. They were splendid in their armour, their weapons gleaming with the light of Goibniu's forge fires, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Behind their lines the Well of Slain stood ready, its waters dark and deep and charged with healing power. The smiths had established their stations, prepared to repair weapons and armour even as the battle raged. Everything that preparation could provide had been provided. Now it would be tested against the oldest and darkest enemies they had ever faced. Across the plain, the Fomorians assembled in a mass of shadow and malevolence. They were not beautiful, these ancient powers, not in the way the Tuatha Dé Danann were beautiful with the radiance of their divine heritage. The Fomorians were forces of chaos given form, and their forms reflected their nature. Some were misshapen, their bodies twisted by the energies that had spawned them. Others seemed almost formless, darkness condensed into something that could grasp a weapon and strike. And at the centre of their host on his elevated platform, Bela sat like a spider at the heart of a web of destruction, his killing eyes still closed but ready to open at the moment of his choosing. The battle began not with the clash of armies but with the combat of champions. It was the custom of wars in that age for heroes to step forward before the general engagement, to test their strength against the greatest fighters the enemy could offer. Blood would be spilled, glory won or lost, and the watching armies would take heart or despair according to the outcomes of these single combats. Ogma was among the first to step forward from the Tuatha Dé Danann lines. The champion of eloquence, whose tongue could move hearts as easily as his arm could shatter shields, strode across the space between the hosts with a confidence born of countless victories. His opponent came forth to meet him, Indesh, a king among the Fomorians whose strength was legendary even among that race of horrors. They circled each other in the pale morning light, taking measure, and then they met in a clash that shook the earth beneath their feet. The combat was terrible and prolonged. Ogma's skill was matched against Index's raw power, and neither could quickly gain the advantage. They traded blows that would have slain lesser beings, their weapons ringing against shield and armour in a rhythm like the heartbeat of war itself. Blood was drawn on both sides. Ogma felt the sting of Fomorian iron opening wounds on his arm, his side. Index staggered under blows that cracked the bones beneath his twisted flesh. They fought until both were gasping, until the watching armies had begun to wonder if either could survive. In the end, they destroyed each other. Ogma's final blow split Index's skull, even as the Fomorian king's blade found Ogma's heart. They fell together, champion of eloquence and monster king, their blood mingling on the soil of Mag Tuired. The Tuatha Dé Danann retrieved Ogma's body and carried it with honour from the field, while the Fomorians dragged Index's carcass back to their lines. First blood had been drawn on both sides. The war had truly begun. What followed was slaughter on a scale that Ireland had never witnessed. The armies crashed together like waves meeting in a storm-tossed sea, and where they met, the dead began to pile in heaps. The Tuatha Dé Danann fought with disciplined ferocity, their weapons striking true, their formations holding even under the most savage pressure. The Fomorians fought with the abandon of creatures that knew only destruction, throwing themselves at their enemies without regard for their own survival, caring only to drag down as many of the bright ones as they could. The advantage shifted back and forth throughout that first day of battle. At times, the Tuatha Dé Danann seemed to be gaining ground, their superior weapons and tactics telling against the Fomorian masses. At other times, the sheer weight of dark numbers threatened to overwhelm them, and they fell back fighting, giving ground they could not afford to lose. Heroes fell on both sides, names that would be remembered in song and story, faces that would never again be seen among the living. But here the preparations of Lugh and his allies proved their worth. When warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann fell wounded, they were carried from the field not to die, but to be healed. Dian Cecht stood beside the Well of Slain, and into its waters went the broken and the bleeding, and out of them came warriors restored, their wounds closed, their strength renewed. Men who had been struck down in the morning's fighting returned to the battle in the afternoon, their enemies staring in disbelief at faces they had thought forever silenced. The Fomorians began to understand that they faced something unprecedented. Their dead stayed dead, but the dead of the Tuatha Dé Danann rose again and again, returning to the fight like spirits that could not be laid to rest. It was demoralizing in a way that simple combat prowess could never match. What good was it to strike down a warrior if he would only return to face you again before the day was out? What hope was there of victory when the enemy seemed to multiply rather than diminish? Yet the Fomorians had a power that could overcome even this advantage. Béla still waited on his platform, his eyes still closed, biding his time. He was patient, was Béla, with the patience of ages. He had watched the battle unfold, had seen his warriors falling, had calculated the moment when his intervention would have the greatest effect, when the Tuatha Dé Danann had committed their full strength, when they believed they might be winning, when their hopes were at their highest. That would be the moment to open his eye and turn those hopes to ash. Lugh knew this. He had fought throughout the day, the spear of Lugh burning like a comet in his hands, cutting swaths through the Fomorian ranks. But even as he fought, he watched. He watched for the moment when the chains would begin to move, when the lid over that terrible eye would start to rise. He was the prophecy after all, he was the doom foretold. Somewhere in the chaos of this battle, his thread and Béla's would finally cross, and the pattern that fate had woven would achieve its completion. The second day of battle was worse than the first. Both sides had learned the rhythms of their enemies, had adapted their tactics, had found new cruelties to inflict. The Fomorians targeted the Well of Slain, sending war parties to try to breach the lines protecting it, knowing that if they could destroy or poison the healing waters, the Tuatha Dé Danann's greatest advantage would be lost. Wave after wave broke against the defenders, and each wave was thrown back, but not without cost. Good warriors died protecting the well, warriors whose bodies could not be healed because they fell defending the very source of healing. The smiths worked without rest, Goibniu and Creedon and Lugh labouring at their stations like men possessed. Weapons broke under the strain of combat, and new weapons were needed constantly. Rivets flew through the air with supernatural accuracy. Spear shafts emerged from Lughtein's hands as fast as warriors could carry them away, and Goibniu's hammer rang against his anvil in a rhythm that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the battle. The Morrigan was on the field now, her presence felt if not always seen. Where she walked, Fomorians suddenly forgot why they had come, dropped their weapons in confusion, turned to flee from enemies they could not see. Her battle cries echoed across the plain, sounds that put strength into the hearts of the Tuatha Dé Danann and dread into the souls of their enemies. She was war itself, walking among them, shaping the conflict according to her terrible will. Nuada Silverhand fought at the head of his warriors, the sword of light flashing in his restored grip. Whatever doubts had ever existed about his fitness to rule were forgotten now. He was every inch a king, leading from the front, his blade drinking deep of Fomorian blood. Warriors who had followed him through decades of wandering found themselves following him into the heart of darkness itself, and they did not hesitate. This was what they had been born for. This was the purpose for which they had mastered their arts and prepared their weapons. Victory or oblivion, there was no third choice. And still Bela waited, his eye closed, his chains motionless. The trap was not yet ready to spring. The third day dawned grey and heavy, the sky pressing down upon Mag Tuatha like a hand upon a wound. Smoke from the previous day's fighting still hung in the air, mixing with the morning mist to create a pall through which the sun struggled and failed to fully penetrate. The ground was churned to mud, not the clean mud of rain, but something darker, thicker, stained with the blood of two peoples who had been killing each other since the battle began. The Tuatha Dé Danann rose from what little rest they had managed, their muscles aching, their spirits stretched thin despite the power of the Well of Slain. For though the well could heal wounds of the body, it could do nothing for the weariness of the soul, the accumulated horror of watching friends die and rise and die again, of killing enemies who seemed to feel no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. Lugh moved among his people in those grey hours before the fighting resumed, speaking words of encouragement, checking weapons, ensuring that each warrior knew their position and their purpose. He was everywhere at once, or so it seemed to those who watched him. A flash of golden hair here, the gleam of his silver armouring there, his voice carrying across the camp with a clarity that cut through the fog of exhaustion. He was not merely a war leader now. He had become something more, a symbol, a promise, the living embodiment of the hope that had sustained the Tuatha Dé Danann through all their long years of subjugation. When they looked at him, they did not see a young champion untested by rulership. They saw the future itself striding among them with a spear that blazed like captured lightning. Across the plain, the Fomorians were stirring as well. Their camp was larger than it had been at the battle's beginning, for reinforcements had been arriving throughout the night. More warriors from the deep places of the sea, more creatures of darkness answering the call of their masters. Bela's platform had been moved closer to the front lines during the night, carried by 100 servants who strained beneath its weight. The king of the Fomorians intended to use his eye today. The time for patience had ended. He would burn the Tuatha Dé Danann from the face of air with a single gaze, and all their healing wells and magical weapons would avail them nothing against the fire that lived behind his eyelid. The Dagda was the first to speak of what they all knew must come. He found Lugh near the Well of Slain, watching as Dian Sesht moved among the cauldrons, preparing for the day's inevitable harvest of wounded warriors. The good god's club rested across his shoulders, that terrible weapon that could kill 9 men with one end and bring them back to life with the other. His face was grim beneath his wild hair, his eyes holding none of the mirth that usually danced within them. "Today is the day," he said, and his voice was low, meant for Lugh's ears alone. "Bela will not wait longer. I can feel it in the air, the gathering of his power, the weight of what is coming. When he opens that eye..." Lugh nodded, his own gaze fixed on the distant platform where the Fomorian king sat motionless, a mountain of malevolent flesh waiting to unleash destruction. "I know. The prophecy speaks of this moment, his death by the hand of his daughter's son. That is me, though he does not know it, cannot know it, or he would have killed me long ago, infant though I was." "The prophecy does not guarantee your survival," the Dagda said quietly. "Only his death. You might strike him down and fall in the same instant. Have you considered this?" Lugh was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried a weight that belied his youth. "I have considered nothing else since I first learned what I was, but it changes nothing. If I die taking Bela with me, then I will die having freed our people from the greatest threat they have ever faced. That is a death worth having." The Dagda placed a heavy hand on Lugh's shoulder, and for a moment the mask of the warrior slipped, revealing something older and sadder beneath. "You are the best of us," he said, "the culmination of everything we have striven for. When I look at you, I see what we might become, not just survivors, not just refugees clinging to power in a land that was never truly ours, but something greater, something worthy of the name we have taken for ourselves." "The tribes of the goddess Danu," Lugh said softly. "Aye, not because of where we came from or what gifts we brought with us, but because of what we have the potential to become. Do not throw that away lightly, Lugh. Kill Bela if you can, but live if you can as well. We will need you in the days that follow, whatever shape those days might take." The war horns sounded before Lugh could reply, their brazen voices cutting through the morning gloom like blades through flesh. The Fomorians were advancing, a tide of darkness rolling across the plain toward the Tuatha Dé Danann's lines. And there, at the centre of their host, Bela's platform moved forward with them, borne by its sweating servants, drawing closer with each passing moment to the range where his terrible gaze could do its work. The fighting began as it had on the previous days, with skirmishes along the lines, probing attacks meant to test defences and identify weaknesses. But there was a different quality to the Fomorian assault now, a desperate urgency that had been absent before. They were not trying to win the battle through attrition or tactical superiority. They were trying to fix the Tuatha Dé Danann in place, to prevent any coordinated assault on Bela's platform, while their king prepared to deploy his most devastating weapon. Nuada saw through the strategy immediately. He had spent decades studying war, had fought in more battles than most warriors could count, and he recognized the signs of what was coming. Turning to the champion who stood at his right hand, he began issuing rapid orders, dispatching runners to different parts of the field, reorganizing his forces for what he knew would be the battle's decisive moment. "We cannot let them pin us down," he told his officers, his silver hand gleaming in the pale light. "If we are static when Bela opens his eye, he will burn us where we stand. We must be moving, spreading out, forcing him to choose his targets rather than sweeping across our entire army at once." It was sound strategy, but it meant abandoning the concentrated formations that had served them so well in the previous day's fighting. The Tuatha Dé Danann spread out across the plain, their lines thinning, their units becoming more isolated. They traded defensive strength for mobility, knowing that the alternative was annihilation. The morning wore on toward midday, and the sun, such as it was, climbed higher behind the veil of smoke and cloud that hung over Mag Tuired. The fighting ebbed and flowed across the blood-soaked ground, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Warriors fell on both sides, some to rise again from the well of slain, others to lie still where they had fallen. The Morrigan circled overhead in her raven form, her cries echoing across the battlefield, her presence a constant reminder that death itself was watching, waiting to claim its due. And then, in the early afternoon, the chains began to move. A great grinding sound echoed across the plain, metal scraping against metal as the mechanism that held Bela's eyelid closed began to lift. Servants strained at the chains, their backs bending under the weight, their feet digging into the wooden platform as they hauled with all their strength. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the massive lid began to rise, and a sickly green light began to seep from beneath it, casting strange shadows across the faces of those nearest to the Fomorian king. The Tuatha Dé Danann saw it happening and responded as they had been ordered. Units broke apart, warriors scattering across the field, presenting no concentrated target for the baleful gaze that was about to be unveiled. But they could not scatter fast enough, could not cover enough ground before the lid rose fully and Bela's eye opened for the first time since the battle began. The light that poured forth was not light at all, not as mortal beings understood it. It was destruction made visible, entropy given form, the cold fire of annihilation that recognized no defense and offered no mercy. Where it touched the ground, the earth blackened and cracked. Where it touched the air itself seemed to burn. And where it touched the warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the screams that rose from the battlefield would haunt the survivors for the rest of their immortal lives. Warriors who had faced every danger their long wanderings had presented, who had mastered arts and crafted weapons that were the envy of every people they had encountered, found themselves burning from within, their very essences unravelling under that terrible regard. The strongest among them withstood it for a few heartbeats before collapsing. The weakest simply ceased to exist, their bodies consumed so completely that not even ash remained to mark their passing. Bela swept his gaze across the field, slowly, methodically, savouring the destruction he was causing. He had waited long enough for this moment, had endured the indignity of watching his warriors struggle against their former slaves, and now at last he could exercise the power that had made him feared across all the worlds he had ever touched. Let the Tuatha Dé Danann scatter like leaves before a storm, He would hunt them down one by one if necessary, burn them from the face of air until not a single one remained to trouble his people's dominion. But even as he turned that terrible eye from one part of the field to another, even as his servants strained to hold the lid open and direct his gaze where he willed, a figure was moving through the chaos of battle. Lugh had been watching for this moment since the dawn. He had positioned himself carefully, staying out of Bela's direct line of sight while working his way closer to the platform, using the confusion of the scattered formations to mask his approach. The spear of Lugh blazed in his hands, its heat burning his palms even through the wrappings he had wound around the shaft, but he did not release it. This weapon was his birthright as much as the prophecy was. This was the instrument through which fate would be fulfilled. He could see his grandfather clearly now, closer than he had ever been to the monster whose blood ran in his veins. Bela was massive, bloated with power and malice, his single terrible eye burning with that sickly green light as it swept across the battlefield. The lid that normally covered it was held open by the straining servants, and Lugh could see the mechanism that controlled it, the chains, the pulleys, the counterweights that made it possible for human strength to lift that enormous weight. The eye began to turn toward him. Lugh did not hesitate. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it with every fibre of his being, and when it arrived, he acted with the speed and precision that had earned him the name Lamfada, Lugh of the Long Arm. The spear of Lugh left his hand like a thunderbolt, like a falling star, like the judgment of heaven itself descending upon the guilty. It crossed the distance between them in less time than it takes to draw breath, and it struck Bela's eye at the exact moment that terrible gaze found the champion who had thrown it. The sound that followed was like nothing that had been heard before or would be heard again. A scream that was also an explosion, a roar that was also a silence, the death cry of something so old and so powerful that its ending sent shockwaves through the very fabric of reality. Bela reeled backward on his platform, the spear buried to its haft in the ruin of his eye, and as he fell, that destructive gaze swept wildly across the Fomorian ranks behind him. His own people, the warriors who had served him for centuries, found themselves caught in the fire of his dying regard. Hundreds of them burned in that instant, consumed by the same power that had made their master so feared. The platform collapsed under Bela's falling weight, and the Fomorian king crashed to the ground of Mag Tuired, his single eye destroyed, his power broken, his long tyranny finally at an end. The chains that had held his eyelid open clanged against the ruined structure, and the servants who had worked them fled in terror, scattering across the battlefield like frightened animals. Their master was dead. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The doom that had been foretold when Bela first imprisoned his daughter to prevent her from bearing a son had come to pass despite all his precautions. For such is the nature of fate. It cannot be avoided, only met. Lugh stood where he had thrown his spear, his arms still extended, his breath coming in great gasps. He was burned. The edge of Bela's gaze had touched him in that final instant, had scored his flesh with wounds that would take even the well of slain time to heal. But he was alive. The prophecy had not demanded his death, only his grandfather's. He had struck down the greatest of the Fomorians and survived to see the results of his deed. And those results were unfolding all around him now, as the tide of battle shifted with the suddenness of a breaking wave. The Fomorians, already reeling from the deaths caused by Bela's wild gaze, found themselves leaderless and terrified. The being they had thought invincible had been struck down by a single throw, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, rallying from their scattered positions, were charging toward them with renewed fury. Nuada Silverhand led the assault, the sword of light blazing in his grip, his voice raised in a battle cry that was taken up by every warrior who heard it. The Dagda was at his side, his club dealing death with one end and meaningless resurrection with the other, for the Fomorians had no well of slain, and warriors brought back by the Dagda's club rose only to be cut down again by the swords of their enemies. The Morrigan descended from the sky in her terrible true form, and where she walked, Fomorians fell in their dozens, their courage broken, their will to fight utterly destroyed. It was not a battle anymore, it was a rout. The Fomorians fled in all directions, some toward the sea from which they had come, some toward the mountains and wild places where they hoped to hide, some simply running without directional purpose. their only thought to escape the vengeance that the Tuatha Dé Danann were visiting upon them. Their champions fell one by one, the great warriors who had enforced Bres's tributes, who had beaten and humiliated the Tuatha Dé Danann during the years of oppression, who had thought themselves masters of a conquered people. They died on the swords and spears of those they had oppressed, and no quarter was asked or given. As the sun began to set over Mag Tuired, painting the western sky in shades of crimson that seemed fitting for a day of such slaughter, the Tuatha Dé Danann stood victorious on a field of the dead. The second battle of Mag Tuired was over, the Fomorians were broken, their king slain, their power shattered beyond any hope of recovery. The land of Éire belonged to the Tuatha Dé Danann now, truly belonged to them in a way it never had before, purchased with blood and consecrated by the sacrifice of those who had fallen to win it. Lugh stood before the corpse of his grandfather, looking down at the ruin of that terrible eye, at the spear still embedded in the socket where it had done its fatal work. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a great weariness and a strange, unexpected sorrow. Bela had been a monster, yes, a tyrant and an oppressor who had brought suffering to countless beings across uncounted ages. But he had also been Lugh's blood, the father of Lugh's mother, part of the pattern that had created the champion who now stood over his broken body. The Dagda approached, his club resting across his shoulders, his face grave. "It is done," he said simply. Lugh nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "The prophecy is fulfilled. Bela is dead by the hand of his daughter's son. The Fomorians are defeated, their threat ended for all time. What happens now?" He trailed off, and Lugh understood what he was not saying. What happened now was uncertain, uncharted, a future that belonged to those who had survived to see it. The Tuatha Dé Danann had achieved their victory, had won their freedom, had established their dominion over the land of Éire. But victory was not an ending. It was a beginning, the first step on a new road that stretched out before them into distances they could not yet imagine. Nuada Silver Hand called the host together as darkness fell, gathering them around the fires that had been lit across the battlefield. The dead, their own dead, those who had fallen beyond the power of the Well of Slain to save, had been gathered for the rites that would send their spirits to whatever awaited them beyond the veil of mortality. The Fomorian dead were left where they had fallen, food for ravens and wolves, a testament to the folly of those who had thought to master a people touched by the arts of the Four Cities. The king spoke of what they had accomplished, of the courage they had shown, of the price they had paid. He spoke of those who had fallen and would not rise again, calling out their names one by one so that they would be remembered. He spoke of the craftsmen who had worked without rest, of the healers who had laboured at the Well of Slain, of the warriors who had held the lines when holding seemed impossible. He spoke of Lugh, the champion of champions, the fulfiller of prophecy, the one who had struck down Bela of the Evil Eye and turned the tide of battle at its darkest moment. And then he spoke of the future. "We have won this land," Nuada said, his silver hand raised to catch the firelight, "but winning and keeping are different things. The Fomorians are defeated, but they are not destroyed. Survivors have fled to the sea, to the wild places, to the shadows where we cannot easily follow. They will nurse their wounds and their hatred, and in time they may grow strong enough to threaten us again. We must be vigilant." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled host, seeing the weariness in their eyes but also the pride, the satisfaction of a people who had achieved something they had scarcely dared to dream of when they first arrived on the shores of Éire. "But more than that," he continued, "we must build. We have been wanderers for too long, rootless and homeless, carrying our treasures and our knowledge from place to place without ever truly belonging anywhere. That time is over. Éire is our home now, truly and forever. Here we will establish ourselves. Here we will create a civilization worthy of the arts we have mastered. Here we will become what we were always meant to be." The Tuatha Dé Danann cheered, their voices rising into the night sky, drowning out the cries of the ravens that still circled over the battlefield. They had come through the fire of war and emerged victorious. The future stretched before them like a promise, full of possibility, full of hope. None of them knew in that moment of triumph that the future held challenges they had not yet imagined. None of them suspected that even now, far across the sea, another people was stirring, a people whose coming would change everything, whose arrival would mark the end of an age and the beginning of another. the sons of Miel were sailing westward, drawn by prophecy and ambition toward the green island that waited beyond the horizon. And when they came, the Tuatha Dé Danann would face a choice that would shape their destiny for all the ages yet to come. But that lay in the future, still hidden behind the veil of time. For now, on this night of victory, the Tuatha Dé Danann celebrated what they had achieved. They sang songs of triumph around the fires of Mag Tuired, songs that would be remembered for centuries, songs that would echo through the ages even after the singers themselves had passed into legend. The songs drifted upward with the smoke of the victory fires, carrying the names of heroes into the darkness, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the night. And as the flames burned low and the exhaustion of battle finally claimed its due, the Tuatha Dé Danann began to dream. Not the troubled dreams of war, but the hopeful dreams of a people who believed themselves masters of their own fate at last. In the days and seasons that followed the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, the Tuatha Dé Danann set about the work of building the civilization Nuada had promised. They spread across the island like seeds scattered by a careful hand, taking possession of the hills and valleys, the rivers and plains, the forests and coastlines that would become the geography of their golden age. Each of the great lords and ladies of the Tuatha Dé Danann claimed their territories, establishing seats of power that would become legendary in the memory of the land. The Dagda, mightiest of the gods, took for himself Pruna Boine, that great tumulus beside the river Boyne where the dead of ages past had been laid to rest. There, in the heart of a monument older than memory, he established a dwelling that existed half in the mortal world and half in somewhere else entirely, a palace of wonders where the walls shifted like dreams and time moved according to laws that had nothing to do with the turning of sun or moon. His great cauldron sat always at the centre of his hall, perpetually full, perpetually steaming with the promise of abundance, a reminder to all who visited that the Dagda's hospitality was as boundless as his appetites. Manannán mac Lir, lord of the waves and the mists between worlds, claimed dominion over the seas surrounding Air, and the mysterious islands that appeared and disappeared according to his will. His realm was not fixed to any single point of geography, but existed wherever the waves whispered secrets to the shore, wherever the fog rolled in to blur the boundaries between what was real and what was possible. He moved between the mortal world and the other world as easily as a man might walk between rooms, and he became the keeper of the ways, the guardian of the passages that connected this existence to all the others that lay just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Ogma, he of the honeyed tongue and the chains that bound willing hearts, became the patron of learning and eloquence, the god to whom poets and scholars would make their offerings in ages yet to come. He took upon himself the task of preserving the knowledge the Tuatha Dé Danann had gathered across their long wanderings, setting down in Ogham script the very system of writing he himself had devised, the histories and genealogies, the spells and incantations, the philosophical meditations that represented the accumulated wisdom of his people. Each straight line and angled notch carved into standing stone carried meaning deeper than its simple appearance might suggest, and those who knew how to read the secret language of Ogma could unlock mysteries hidden from the uninitiated. Brigid, daughter of the Dagda, became patroness of crafts and poetry, of healing and the sacred flame. At Kildare, she established a sanctuary where fire burned eternally, tended by priestesses who would maintain the tradition long after the memory of its origins had faded into myth. She was goddess of the forge and the hearth, of the well and the spring, of all the places where transformation occurred, where raw metal became gleaming blade, where water became health, where inspiration descended upon the waiting mind of the poet and turned ordinary words into verses that could move the heart to joy or tears. Her influence spread across the land like the warmth of a banked fire, gentle but inextinguishable, touching everything it encountered with the spark of creative potential. Nuada himself, his silver hand gleaming with the art of Diancesh and the craft of his son, ruled from Tara, that sacred hill that had been the spiritual centre of Air long before the Tuatha Dé Danann had arrived. The stone of Fal stood there still, the great stone that had roared beneath Nuada when he was proclaimed king, and it would roar again whenever a true high king placed his feet upon its surface. From Tara, Nuada could see the whole of his kingdom spread before him, the green fields and silver rivers, the dark forests and windswept hills, the coastlines where the sea met the land in perpetual conversation. He ruled wisely and well, tempering the fierce pride of his people with the hard-won wisdom that had come from his years of loss and restoration, and Lugh, the hero of Mag Tuired, the slayer of Bela, the many-skilled champion who had arrived as a stranger and departed as a legend. Lugh took for himself the bright half of the year. The festival of Lugnasad would be held in his honour at harvest time, a celebration of the abundance he had helped to secure, a remembrance of the victory he had won. He moved through the lands of the Tuatha Dé Danann like sunlight through clouds, appearing where he was needed, departing when his work was done, his presence a blessing that could transform the fortunes of any endeavour he chose to favour. These were the years of plenty, the years when the Tuatha Dé Danann achieved all that they had dreamed of during their wanderings. The island of Éire flourished under their care like a garden tended by master cultivators. Crops grew tall and golden in fields, blessed by Brigid's warmth and the Dagda's abundance. Craftsmen produced works of such beauty and intricacy that later generations would look upon them with wonder, unable to understand how such perfection had been achieved. Poets composed verses that seemed to capture something eternal, words that would survive the passage of millennia because they touched upon truths that transcended the circumstances of their creation. The great treasures of the four cities remained at the heart of Tuatha Dé Danann civilization, anchors of power that sustained the magic woven through every aspect of their existence. The Stone of Fál continued to guard the kingship, its voice the ultimate arbiter of legitimate rule. The Spear of Lugh hung in a place of honour, its tip still hungry for battle even in these times of peace, still straining toward conflict like a hound that remembers the hunt. The Sword of Nuada rested in its scabbard, that blade from which no enemy had ever escaped once it was drawn, patient and terrible in its stillness. And the cauldron of the Dagda continued to pour forth its endless bounty, feeding all who came to the great hall of Bruna Boine, turning away no one who hungered. Yet even in this golden age, shadows gathered at the edges. The Fomorians had been defeated but not destroyed, just as Nuada had warned. In the wild places of the world, in the depths of the sea and the darkness beneath the mountains, survivors of Bela's people nursed their hatred and waited. They were too few now, too broken to pose any serious threat to the power of the Tuatha Dé Danann. But hatred does not require numbers to sustain itself. It can survive in a single heart, burning like an ember that refuses to die, waiting for the wind that will fan it back to flame. More troubling were the whispers that began to reach the shores of Éire from far across the Western Sea. Stories carried by Manannán mac Lir himself, who alone among the Tuatha Dé Danann travelled freely between worlds and oceans. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond even the furthest islands that Manannán claimed as his own, a people were stirring. They called themselves the Gaels, the descendants of a hero named Miel, who had himself descended from a lineage stretching back to Scythia and beyond. They were mortal in a way the Tuatha Dé Danann had never quite been, their lives measured in decades rather than centuries, their bodies subject to age and illness and all the limitations that flesh imposed. But they were numerous, and they were ambitious, and they were drawn by prophecy toward a green island in the west that had been promised to them by their seers and druids. The Milesians, as they would come to be called, had been wandering for generations, moving from land to land in search of the home that had been foretold for them. Egypt had sheltered them for a time, and there they had learned arts of their own. Not the high magic of the four cities, but practical wisdom, military discipline, and a fierce pride that would not accept subjugation. From Egypt they had travelled to Scythia, and from Scythia they had come at last to Iberia, that peninsula at the western edge of the known world. There they had established themselves, building a civilization that prospered even as it looked always toward the setting sun, toward the misty horizon beyond which their destiny awaited. It was in Iberia that the threads of fate began to converge. Eith, nephew of Miel himself, had climbed the great tower of Brigantia on a clear winter's night, and had seen, impossibly, the outline of a green island far across the waves. Whether it was a trick of the light, a vision granted by the gods, or some more subtle magic reaching out from Éire itself, none could say with certainty. But Eith knew with absolute conviction that this was the land his people had been promised, the final destination of their generations-long journey. He gathered a company of his kin and sailed westward, following the vision that had burned itself into his memory. The voyage was long and perilous, the sea reluctant to yield passage to these newcomers who had no agreement with Manannán mac Lir, no understanding with the powers that governed wind and wave. But Eth and his companions persevered, their determination forged by centuries of wandering and the certainty that their goal lay just beyond reach. When they finally sighted the shores of Ayr, the company wept with joy. The land was everything the vision had promised and more. Green hills rolling toward blue mountains, rivers gleaming like silver threads, forests dense with ancient growth, coastlines where white waves broke against dark stone. It was a land that seemed to pulse with life, to breathe with a vitality that made the countries they had left behind seem pale and exhausted by comparison. Eth and his companions landed on the southern coast and began to make their way inland, marvelling at the richness of the soil, the abundance of game, the mild sweetness of the air. They encountered no resistance at first, no guards or patrols to challenge their presence. The land seemed empty of inhabitants, though the signs of cultivation and settlement were everywhere. Fields that had been tilled, paths that had been worn smooth by the passage of feet, standing stones that spoke of ritual and belief. The Tuatha Dé Danann watched these strangers from the shadows, from the mists that gathered at their command, from the high places where mortal eyes could not easily follow. They watched and they deliberated, uncertain how to respond to this intrusion. The newcomers were few in number, their weapons primitive by the standards of those who wielded the treasures of the four cities, their magic, if they possessed any, invisible to those who could see the flows of power that ran through the world. They posed no threat, not in themselves. A single champion of the Tuatha Dé Danann could have destroyed the entire company without breaking stride. But the seers had seen what lay behind these few explorers, the great fleet gathering in Iberia, the thousands of warriors preparing for the voyage west, the ambition that drove an entire people toward the green island of prophecy. These scouts were merely the first drops of a coming storm, and the storm itself would not be so easily dismissed. It was decided that 3 of the kings who then shared rulership of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Macquill, Macsest, and Macgreen, who had succeeded to power in the years since Mag Tuired, would meet with the strangers and learn their intentions. These 3 were grandsons of the Dagda himself, lords of tremendous power in their own right, and their wives, Banba, Fodla, and Eriu, were goddesses of the land itself, their names so deeply woven into the fabric of Ayr that the island could scarcely be conceived of apart from them. The meeting took place at the Hill of Wisneach, the sacred centre of the island, the navel from which the 5 provinces radiated outward like the petals of a flower. Here the fire of Beltane was kindled each year, its flames visible from every corner of the land, its light a reminder of the unity that bound the Tuatha Dé Danann together despite their individual territories and preferences. It was fitting that the first formal encounter between the lords of the land and those who would challenge their supremacy should take place at this spot where all boundaries converged. Eth came to the meeting with his companions, their eyes wide with wonder at the hill and its monuments, at the ancient stones that seemed to hum with contained power. The 3 kings received them with courtesy, but also with a cool reserve that made clear the visitors were being assessed, measured, judged by standards they could not entirely comprehend. The conversation that followed would be remembered differently by each side, its meaning contested across the centuries that lay ahead. Eth spoke of his vision from the Tower of Brigantia, of the long wanderings of his people, of the prophecy that had promised them a home in the Western Sea. He spoke admiringly of the land he had seen, praising its beauty, its fertility, its obvious suitability for the civilization his people wished to build. He spoke perhaps too admiringly, his words carrying an undertone of covetousness that the 3 kings did not fail to notice. Macquill, Macsest, and Macgrain listened in silence, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. They asked questions about the Milesians, their numbers, their skills, their reasons for leaving each of the lands they had inhabited. They were polite, even gracious, but beneath the courtesy was a hardness that Ith, in his excitement, failed to recognize. When the meeting concluded, Eth and his companions were allowed to depart freely, to return to their ship and sail back to Iberia with their report. But as they made their way toward the coast, walking through valleys that seemed to grow steadily darker despite the position of the sun, they realized that they were not alone. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, shapes that might have been men or might have been something else entirely. The path that had been so easy to follow on their journey inland now seemed to twist and double back upon itself, leading them through marshes and thickets they did not remember crossing before. It was in one of these dark places that the attack came. Whether it was ordered by the three kings or undertaken by others who feared what Ith's report might bring, none could say with certainty. The histories would record it simply as treachery, an ambush that fell upon the small company without warning, without declaration, without any of the honourable forms that should govern conflict between peoples who might yet share the world in peace. Ith was struck down, mortally wounded by weapons that moved too fast for mortal eyes to follow. His companions fought desperately, but were overwhelmed by enemies they could barely see. A few managed to escape, to reach the ship and sail back toward Iberia with their terrible news. Ith himself survived just long enough to be carried aboard, to look one last time toward the green island that had promised so much and delivered only death. He died on the voyage home, his blood staining the deck of the ship that had brought him to his destiny, his final breath a whispered curse upon those who had slain him. When the survivors reached Iberia and told their tale, when the body of Ith was carried before the sons of Miel, the reaction was everything the seers of the Tuatha Dé Danann had feared. Grief turned to rage with the speed of a summer storm. The Milesians had come in peace, in curiosity, in the innocent hope of finding the home that had been promised to them. They had been met with murder. The blood of Ith cried out for vengeance, and the sons of Miel, his own kinsmen, heirs to the martial traditions of Scythia and Egypt, warriors who had never yet met defeat in battle, swore upon the body of their fallen uncle that they would answer that cry. The great fleet that the seers had foreseen began to gather in earnest. Ships were built or commandeered from every harbour of Iberia, their holds filled with warriors and weapons, with supplies for a voyage and a campaign, with families and livestock and all the other necessities that a people brings when it intends not merely to raid, but to settle, to conquer, to stay. The sons of Miel themselves would lead the expedition, Eberfin and Eramon and Amergin, each of them a hero in his own right, each of them burning with the desire to avenge their kinsmen and claim the inheritance that had been prophesied. Amergin was perhaps the most remarkable of them all, a man who united in himself the roles of warrior, poet, and druid. He could read the patterns of stars and the flights of birds, could speak words of power that bent reality to his will, could compose verses that would live forever in the memory of those who heard them. He was the voice of the expedition, the one who would speak for the Milesians in all councils and confrontations, and his tongue was a weapon as deadly as any sword in the fleet. As the preparations continued, as the fleet grew larger day by day, the Tuatha Dé Danann debated what was to come. Some counselled immediate action, a preemptive strike against the harbours of Iberia, a storm called down by Manannan himself to scatter the fleet before it could set sail. The power to do such things existed among the lords of the four cities, and there were those who saw no reason to wait for the enemy to come to them. But others counselled patience, caution, a measured response to a threat that had not yet fully materialised. The killing of Ith had been a mistake. This much was generally acknowledged, whatever private satisfactions some might have felt at removing a spy from their midst. It had transformed a potential negotiation into a certain war, had given the Milesians a cause that would unite them and drive them forward with religious fervour. More violence would only compound that error, would make reconciliation impossible, even if circumstances later favoured it. And beneath all the tactical considerations lurked a deeper unease, a suspicion that some among the Tuatha Dé Danann did not voice but could not entirely dismiss. The seers had seen the coming of the Milesians, but they had also seen, or thought they had seen, something beyond that coming, a transformation that defied easy understanding. The age of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the golden era they had fought so hard to establish, might be drawing to a close regardless of any action they took. The wheel of history was turning, carrying the world from one age into another, and not even the power of the four treasures could hold back the fundamental changes that such turnings brought. The ships of the Milesians set sail on a day when the wind blew strong from the east, as if the very elements were conspiring to speed the invaders toward their destination. 30 ships in some tellings, 300 in others. The exact number varied with the teller and the century, but all agreed that it was a fleet such as Air had never seen, an armada carrying a people who had no intention of turning back. Manannan mac Lir watched them come from his realm between the waves, tracking their progress across the ocean that was his domain. He could have stopped them, could have called up storms to sink every ship, could have wrapped the fleet in mist so thick that no navigator could find the way forward. The sea was his, and the sea was deadly to those who travelled upon it without his blessing. But Manannán did nothing, or nothing that the histories record. Perhaps he'd seen the same thing the seers had seen, the inevitability of change, the futility of resisting what was destined to occur. Perhaps he was bound by laws older than himself, obligations that prevented him from interfering in the contest between peoples that would determine the fate of the island. Perhaps he simply wished to see what would happen, to watch the drama unfold without prejudging its outcome. The fleet sailed on day after day, following the star that Emergin had fixed as their guide. The weather remained fair, the winds remained favourable, and the spirits of the Milesians remained high despite the vast unknown that lay before them. They sang songs of their ancestors, of Miel and his fathers, of Scythia and Egypt and all the lands they had passed through on their way to this moment. They sang songs of Eth, of his vision and his death, of the vengeance that awaited those who had betrayed him. They sang songs of the green island that lay ahead, the promised land that would be their home forever, the inheritance that had been foretold since before any of them had been born. And then, on a morning when the mist lay thick upon the water, they saw it. Air rising from the sea like something out of a dream, its mountains touched with gold by the rising sun, its shores dark against the silver waves. The fleet came together, ships clustering around the flagship where the sons of Miel stood at the prow, their faces grim with purpose, their hands upon their weapons. Emergin raised his voice in a chant that would be remembered for millennia, words of power that called upon the land itself to witness their arrival, to judge the righteousness of their cause, to accept them or reject them according to laws older than the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves. His words rolled across the water like thunder, reached the shores of air and echoed among the hills, penetrated the hidden places where the lords of the four cities waited and watched. The contest for air was about to begin. The fleet made landfall at Immerse, in the southwestern reaches of the island where the mountains rose steep from the sea, and the harbours were deep enough to shelter even the largest of vessels. The Milesians came ashore with weapons drawn and prayers upon their lips, expecting at any moment to face the terrible power of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the magic that had been whispered about in every port from Egypt to Iberia. But no army met them on the beach. No wall of flame barred their progress. The sands were empty save for the crying of gulls and the crash of waves upon the rocks. This was deliberate. The three kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Macquil, Macsecht and Macgrain, had chosen not to contest the landing itself. They remembered how the Fomorians had been defeated in part because they had allowed themselves to be drawn into battle on ground not of their choosing, at a time not of their choosing. The Milesians would be allowed to come ashore, to march inland to see the land they claimed to covet, and then, when the three kings chose the moment, the full power of the Tuatha Dé Danann would be brought to bear. The sons of Miel led their people up from the shore, following paths that wound through valleys lush with growth, past streams that ran clear and cold from the mountains. Everything they saw confirmed what Eth had reported before his death. This was indeed a land of unparalleled beauty, of fertility beyond imagining, of resources that would sustain a people for countless generations. The warriors who had grumbled about the length of the voyage fell silent as they walked, overwhelmed by the evidence of their own eyes. The poets began composing verses on the spot, unable to contain their wonder at the green hills and ancient forests that surrounded them on every side. Emergin walked at the head of the column, and with every step he felt something stirring in the earth beneath his feet. The land was aware of their presence. It was watching them, judging them, weighing their worth against some standard he could not quite perceive. His druid's training had taught him to sense the currents of power that flowed through the world, and here in air those currents ran deeper and stronger than anywhere he had ever been. This was not merely a fertile island. This was a place where the boundaries between the mortal world and other realms grew thin, where magic was woven into the very soil, where ancient forces slumbered and sometimes woke. They marched for 3 days before they encountered the first of the queens. Her name was Banba, and she appeared to them suddenly on a hilltop where no one had stood a moment before, clad in robes that shifted colour with the light, her hair dark as a raven's wing, her eyes bright with a knowledge that seemed to encompass all of time. The Milesian warriors reached for their weapons, but Emergin raised his hand to stay them. He walked forward alone, stopping at a respectful distance from the queen, and inclined his head in greeting. Banba spoke first. She welcomed them to the island, asked them who they were and why they had come, listened as Emergin recounted the tale of their wanderings and their claim to the land. Her face remained impassive throughout his recitation, revealing nothing of her thoughts or intentions. Only when he had finished did she speak again, and her words were unexpected. She asked them for a boon. If they should prevail in their quest, if they should take the island and hold it against all comers, she asked that it bear her name forever. "Let the poets and historians call it Banba," she said, "and let her memory endure through all the ages of the world." Immerse, struck by the dignity of the request and perhaps sensing something in her manner that suggested the Tuatha Dé Danann did not expect to win the coming conflict, agreed without hesitation. The land would bear her name, her memory would endure. Banba smiled then, a smile that held more sorrow than joy, and vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. They encountered the second queen 2 days later, as the column wound its way through a valley where ancient oaks grew so thick that their branches formed a canopy overhead, blocking out all but scattered shafts of sunlight. Fodla was her name, and she too appeared without warning, stepping from behind a tree that could not possibly have concealed her. Her hair was the colour of autumn leaves, her skin pale as moonlight, her voice like water running over smooth stones. She too welcomed them, questioned them, listened to their answers. She too asked for a boon, that the land bear her name, that she be remembered when all else was forgotten. Immerse gave his word without hesitation, feeling the weight of the promise settling upon him like a mantle. Fodla too vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of wildflowers and the memory of her strange, sad smile. The third queen they met at Tara itself, at the sacred hill where the stone of Fal stood upon its mound, and the kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann held their court. Eriu was her name, the most powerful of the three sisters, the one whose very essence was bound up with the island itself. She stood beside the stone of Fal, and the stone was silent as the Milesians approached, making no sound, offering no judgment on those who climbed the sacred hill. The three kings stood behind her, Mac Cuil, Mac Sesht, and Mac Grain, their husbands, the sons of Kermé, the grandsons of the Dagda himself. Around them gathered the lords and warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann, hundreds strong, their weapons glinting in the afternoon light, their faces stern and watchful. Eriu spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the stones and trees and rivers, from every part of the island that had given her its name. She acknowledged the Milesians' claim, acknowledged the ancient prophecy that had guided their journey, acknowledged that the contest for the island could not be avoided. But she asked her question differently than her sisters had. Not merely whether the land would bear her name, but whether the Milesians would honour the land itself, would care for it as the Tuatha Dé Danann had cared for it, would understand that they were not merely conquering a territory, but accepting a sacred trust. Emergin's answer was one of the most famous passages in all of Irish literature, though the exact words have been remembered differently by different tellers. He spoke of his love for the land, his understanding of its nature, his acceptance of the obligations that came with dwelling upon it. He swore that the Milesians would be worthy stewards, that they would honour the powers that had dwelt there before them, that the name of Eriu would be spoken with reverence for as long as any speaker of their tongue remained alive. His words satisfied her, or perhaps she had already known what he would say, had seen the shape of the future, and found it acceptable despite the losses it would bring. But the promise of a name was not enough to prevent war. The three kings stepped forward when Eriu had withdrawn, and their manner was very different from that of their wives. They had not forgotten Ith. They had not forgotten that these invaders came seeking vengeance as well as land. They had not forgotten that the Tuatha Dé Danann had won their own place in air through blood and fire, and they did not intend to surrender it without a struggle. The negotiations that followed were tense, conducted against the backdrop of two armies watching each other across a narrow space, each waiting for the signal to attack. The sons of Miel demanded that the Tuatha Dé Danann surrender the island immediately, accepting whatever terms the victors chose to impose. The three kings refused, offering instead to share the land, to divide it between the two peoples according to some arrangement that would give each their due. Neither side would accept the other's terms. The tension mounted with every exchange, every rejection, every counter-proposal that satisfied no one. It was Emergin who found a way through the impasse, though whether his solution was wisdom or folly has been debated ever since. He proposed that the Milesians withdraw from the island, returning to their ships and sailing out beyond the ninth wave, the traditional boundary of the island's sovereignty, the point beyond which Air's magic held no sway. Once there, they would attempt to make landfall a second time. If the Tuatha Dé Danann could prevent them from landing, the island would remain theirs, and the Milesians would sail away forever to seek their fortunes elsewhere. But if the Milesians succeeded in reaching the shore, despite whatever opposition the Tuatha Dé Danann could muster, then the island would belong to the newcomers, and the Tuatha Dé Danann would accept their defeat. It was a proposal that appealed to both sides' sense of honour, their belief in the judgment of fate, their confidence in their own power. The three kings consulted briefly with their advisors, with Eriu and her sisters, with the greatest of their druids and seers. They agreed to the terms. The Milesians would withdraw beyond the ninth wave. The Tuatha Dé Danann would use every art at their command to prevent their return, and the outcome, whatever it might be, would be accepted as the will of the powers that governed such things. The Milesians marched back to their ships at Immerse, their spirits high despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. They had walked the green hills of Air, had breathed its air and drunk from its springs, had seen with their own eyes that it was everything their prophets had promised. They had gained the blessing of the three queens, had extracted the promise that the land would bear the name Eriu, a name that would evolve over the centuries into Eri, and eventually into Ireland. Whatever happened in the coming battle, they had already won something that could never be taken from them. The ships put out from the harbour and sailed into the open ocean, counting the waves until they had passed beyond the ninth, until they floated in waters that belonged to no land and no people. There they waited, watching the distant shore, preparing themselves for what was to come. Amergin stood at the prow of the flagship, his staff raised, his voice already beginning the chants that would call upon the powers of sky and sea to favour their approach. The other druids joined him, their voices blending with his, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. On the shore, the three kings prepared their response. They gathered the greatest druids of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the masters of weather and wave, the shapers of wind and storm. Together they began to weave a tempest such as mortal eyes had never witnessed, calling upon the deepest forces of their magic to create a barrier that no fleet could penetrate. The sky darkened with unnatural speed, clouds rolling in from every direction to converge above the waiting ships. The wind rose from a whisper to a howl to a scream that seemed to tear at the very air itself. The waves, moments before calm and glittering, grew into mountains of black water that towered above even the tallest masts. The storm struck the Milesian fleet with a fury that defied description. Ships were thrown about like leaves in a hurricane, their sails torn to ribbons, their oars snapped like twigs, their hulls groaning under stresses they were never meant to endure. The screams of men were lost in the howling of the wind, the thunder of the waves, the crack of timbers giving way. Ships began to founder, taking their crews down into the lightless depths where Manannán mac Lir held sway. 5 of the sons of Miel died in that storm, drowned in waters that churned with unnatural violence, their bodies never recovered from the sea that had claimed them. Amergin fought back with every art he knew. His voice rose above the storm, words of power that countered the magic of the Tuatha Dé Danann, that sought to calm the waves and still the wind, that called upon the land itself to welcome its rightful rulers. The other druids added their strength to his, creating a shield of will and word that protected the surviving ships from the worst of the tempest's fury. For hours the battle raged, magic against magic, will against will, 2 peoples struggling for supremacy in a contest that transcended the merely physical. Slowly, impossibly, the Milesian fleet began to make headway. The ships that had survived the initial onslaught formed up around the flagship, sheltering behind Emergin's power, crawling toward the shore through waves that still sought to drag them down. The druids of the Tuatha Dé Danann poured more and more of their strength into the storm, trying to maintain the barrier, trying to push the invaders back beyond the 9th wave where they would have to concede defeat. But Amergin's power proved greater, or his determination stronger, or his cause more favoured by whatever forces judge such contests. The storm began to falter, the waves began to subside, the wind, though still fierce, no longer held the killing edge that had destroyed so many ships. The Milesian fleet made landfall for the second time, not at Immerse but at Inverculptha, near the mouth of the River Boyne. The survivors came ashore wet and exhausted, grieving for their dead but exultant in their victory. They had passed the test. They had overcome the magic of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The island was theirs by right of trial, and no power in the world could gainsay their claim. But the three kings had no intention of honouring the agreement so easily. Whether they had ever meant to accept defeat, whether they had simply hoped the storm would be sufficient to destroy the invaders, whether they believed that a contest of magic was different from a contest of the arms, whatever their reasoning, they gathered their warriors and marched to meet the Milesians on the field of battle. The agreement had been for a trial by fate, but fate would be tested once more with sword and spear. 2 battles followed, the first at Sliab Miss, where the armies clashed in a fury of blood and iron. The Milesians were fewer than they had been, their numbers thinned by the storm, their spirits wearied by the ordeal they had endured. But they fought with the desperation of those who had nowhere else to go, who had staked everything on this one throw of the dice, who would win or die in the attempt. Faes, the wife of one of the dead sons of Miel, fell in this battle, and the plain where she died would bear her name forever after. But the Tuatha Dé Danann also suffered grievously, their warriors falling to weapons wielded by hands that had been hardened by generations of wandering and war. The second battle, the decisive battle, was fought at Tailtiu, in the green heartland of the island. Here the three kings committed everything they had, every warrior, every weapon, every scrap of magic that remained to them. Here the sons of Miel who had survived brought together their own forces for a final confrontation. Here the fate of Éire would be decided once and for all. The Battle of Tailtiu was terrible beyond the telling. The Tuatha Dé Danann fought with the courage of those defending their homeland, their sacred places, their very existence as a people. The Milesians fought with the fury of those avenging their murdered kin, claiming their prophesied inheritance, proving themselves worthy of the land they sought to possess. Magic clashed with magic. Sword rang against sword. The ground grew dark with blood, and the air filled with the cries of the wounded and the dying. MacQuill fell, MacSect fell, MacGrain fell. The three kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann died on the field of Tailtiu, and with them died the last hope of resistance. Their queens, Bamba, Fodla and Eriu, died beside them, for they could not survive the death of their husbands, their power too deeply intertwined with the kings they had married. The leaderless remnants of the Tuatha Dé Danann army broke and fled, scattered across the island they could no longer call their own, seeking shelter in whatever hidden places might receive them. The Milesians had won. The island was theirs. But what does it mean to win a war against gods? The Tuatha Dé Danann were not mortal in the way the Milesians understood mortality. They could not simply be killed and forgotten, their bodies returning to the earth like those of ordinary men and women. Their power remained, diminished but unbroken, woven too deeply into the fabric of the island to be removed by any force of arms. They could not hold the surface world against its new masters, but they did not have to vanish entirely. The Dagda, who had survived the battle though many of his children had not, led the remnants of his people to the places where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The hollow hills, the ancient mounds, the caves that opened onto darkness that was not merely the absence of light, these became the refuges of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gateways to a realm that existed alongside the mortal world but was not of it. They withdrew from the sunlit lands they had ruled, ceding the surface to the Milesians, but they did not depart entirely. They became something else, something that the people who came after would call the Aussie, the people of the mounds, the fair folk, the good neighbours who must be propitiated but never offended. Manannán and Maclear took on the task of hiding their new realm from mortal eyes, weaving mists and enchantments that made the entrances invisible to those who had not been granted the sight to see them. The 4 treasures were carried into the hidden places, their power preserved against some future need that the seers could not yet perceive clearly. The Stone of Fal remained at Tara, the one treasure that stayed in the mortal world, but its voice fell silent for mortal kings, saving its cry for those rare individuals who still carried traces of the old blood in their veins. The age of the Tuatha Dé Danann had ended, the age of the Gael had begun, but endings in Irish mythology are never truly final. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not vanish, they transformed. They became the invisible powers that shaped the land, the spirits that dwelt in every hill and stream and ancient tree. They became the subjects of story and song, the figures that flickered at the edges of vision, the voices that whispered in the wind. They became the explanation for everything that could not otherwise be explained, the source of every blessing and every curse. The old gods who demanded respect even after newer gods had taken their place. Centuries would pass, and new waves of belief would wash over the island. Christianity would come, and the monks who preserved the old stories would transform them, adding layers of interpretation that fitted them into a biblical framework, making the Tuatha Dé Danann into fallen angels or demon worshippers, or merely mortal wizards with unusual abilities. But beneath all the changes, beneath all the retellings and revisions and attempts to rationalize the irrational, the essential truth remained. The Tuatha Dé Danann had been real as any gods have ever been, as real as the human need to understand the world through story and symbol. They had come from the northern islands of the world, bringing treasures that embodied the deepest aspirations of their people. They had fought and won and ruled and lost and withdrawn, following a pattern as old as time itself, the eternal cycle of rise and fall that governs all peoples and all powers. The stone still stands at Tara, weathered by centuries of rain and wind, but still recognizable, still carrying whatever spark of the Leofeil's ancient power might remain. The hills still rise across the Irish landscape, their interiors hidden from all but those who know how to look. The stories are still told, passed down from generation to generation, adapted and transformed but never quite forgotten. And sometimes, on certain nights when the moon is full and the mist lies thick upon the land, there are those who claim to catch glimpses of the old world, the shine of otherworldly light beneath a fairy mound, the sound of music that no mortal instrument could produce, the sense of being watched by eyes that have seen the turning of ages. The Tuatha Dé Danann came out of the north, bearing the 4 treasures that would shape the destiny of an island. They fought 2 battles at Mag Tuired, the first against the Firbolg, the second against the Fomorians, and in those battles they established themselves as the rulers of a land that would remember their names forever. They gave Ayr its kings and its queens, its heroes and its sorcerers, its druids and its poets. They gave it Nuada of the Silver Hand and Lugh of the Long Arm, the Dagda with his club and his cauldron, Brigid with her forge and her healing. They gave it stories that would outlast empires, myths that would survive the death of the gods themselves, and when their time was done, when the wheel had turned and a new age had dawned, they did not rage against the dying of the light. They withdrew with dignity, accepting their transformation, becoming something new that would endure when their mortal forms could not. They became the hidden people, the good neighbours, the Aossi who dwell in the hollow hills and the ancient mounds, who must be honoured with offerings and prayers, who reward those who show them respect and punish those who give offence. Perhaps they are still there, in their underground kingdoms, feasting and fighting and making music that mortals can only dream of. Perhaps they watch us still, these descendants of those first Milesians who took their surface world, and perhaps they smile at how little we understand of the powers that surround us. Perhaps, on nights when the boundaries grow thin, they slip through the cracks between worlds and walk once more beneath the stars they once ruled. The Lebor Gabála Érenn tells us that Ireland was invaded 5 times, that each wave of settlers displaced those who came before, that the Tuatha Dé Danann was simply one chapter in a longer story. But they were the chapter that mattered most, the one that gave the island its soul, that planted in its soil the seeds of wonder that would bloom for millennia. They were the ones who brought the treasures, who fought the demons, who built the sacred sites that still draw pilgrims and seekers to this day. Their story ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, trailing off into silence and mystery, into the mists that Manannán mac Lir wove around their hidden realm. They are gone but not forgotten, departed but not destroyed, transformed but not obliterated. They are the eternal presence beneath the surface of Irish culture, the deep root from which all the later flowers grew, and somewhere beneath the green hills of Ireland, in halls that no mortal eye has seen, the 4 treasures still wait, the stone that cries out for the true king, the spear that never misses its mark, the sword from which no enemy escapes, the cauldron that never fails to satisfy. They wait for a time that the seers have not yet revealed, for a purpose that the stories have not yet told, for a hero who may not yet have been born. The Tuatha Dé Danann are patient, they have eternity to wait, and the stories, like the people who tell them, go on.